Professor Joel Robbins with us, who's such a distinguished scholar that all of us have read, and so I know I'm excited, and I know our students are excited to be here. To introduce him and to welcome everyone also, I'd like to call on Professor Bob Hefner, who's the primary sponsor of the event.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming today, but I want to thank in particular Dee Moore, Mary Elizabeth Moore, for this collaboration now in our 5th year in sponsoring the annual, now the 5th annual, Peter Berger Lecture in the Anthropology and Sociology of Religion, or is it the Sociology and Anthropology of Religion? Dean Ammerman, I'm not sure. And I want to thank Dana Robert for really always being such a great partner and supporter of cross-disciplinary, cross-school activities in the study of religion and world affairs. That much said, let me just make a brief introduction. I'm not going to go into a long introduction of Joel Robbins. Joel has just moved, just a few notes, he's just moved from the University of California, San Diego, where he was chair for, I believe, 4 years. And he now calls home Cambridge University in the UK, Department of Anthropology. He is a rather remarkable and versatile person. When, just a quick historic note to sort of date myself, when Dana Robert and I, back I think around 1991 or 92, thought about putting together a conference on conversion to world religions, which subsequently morphed actually and more narrowly, even though I'm a scholar of Islam primarily, it morphed into a conference on conversion to Christianity, a comparative study of conversion to Christianity. When we did that, the reason the morph took place was because at a cross-national, cross-regional level, there was so little really solid work being done in comparative study of Christian conversion and Christianity. There was work, there was very fine work, in mission studies, of which Professor Dana Robert is an exemplary example. But in the social sciences, even though there had been a great transformation in comparative religious studies in the 1980s, late 1970s and 1980s, and so we had Islamic studies, even in anthropology. We had Buddhist studies. We had a really, really vibrant, by this time, late 1980s, early 1980s, really vibrant study of comparative Hinduism and other, quote unquote, world religions, and we do want to put that in quotes. Even though those fields exist and were alive and well in sociology, anthropology, and comparative religious studies, the comparative study, especially in my discipline, anthropology, the comparative study of Christianity was something that was still relatively uncommon. There were some people who had done it. There were some people who had called for a comparative anthropological study of Christianity, but there was, to be, I think, just a bit too quick about it, but not much. There was considerable hostility to the idea that anthropologists would study Christianity in anything other than, if you will, a colonial / post-colonial historical mode. But to take Christianity on its own terms, the way in which it impacts communities, in which it impacts subjectivities, the ways in which concepts of ethics, morality, subjectivity, citizenship are recast in the aftermath of conversion to Christianity. Issues, I might add, that were already being discussed in the anthropology of Hinduism, the anthropology of Islam, the anthropology of Buddhism. These had not yet been done. So there we were. I think we were a little younger then. 1991, talking about this conference, and as I said, it morphed into a conference on conversion to Christianity because we realized that there was such a gaping absence, a need for such comparative study. Now let's jump ahead. And I will jump ahead because that is what I've described here as far as anthropology, and of course, as far as comparative religious studies, we have some very fine representatives here. Historical study of Christianity, We're now in an entirely new age. So, and it's a comparative study of Christianity. It's interdisciplinary and really one of the great successes of the last 15 or so years, a true transformation in the field. But from the discipline of anthropology's perspective, there is one figure, here's the introduction, one figure more than any other who has played not just a kind of supportive or even leading role, but a provocatively exemplary kind of thunderstruck new ideas role, and that is Professor Joel Robbins. His work, he did work, came from the University of Virginia. He was friends with and a kind of distant student of a gentleman who used to be a professor here, Frederick Barth, who had done a little known, but from comparative anthropological perspective, but really, really magnificent, I read it as a grad student, work on the Baktamen of New Guinea. They weren't yet Christian. So here was Joel Robbins, who came up and sort of from this very, very eclectic background, with an interest in, among other things, not just linguistic anthropology, but language, philosophy, and concepts of self and subjectivity. He brings this with a really, really remarkably vigorous sense of the comparative anthropology of religion in all fields, with, in turn, and this was already there in his work as he comes up in the late 90s and early 2000s, a concern to rethink questions of what ethics are, from an anthropological perspective, from a sociological perspective, from a perspective that wants to think ethics not just in terms of, if you will, a formal system, a textual tradition, or even a kind of generalized discursive tradition in whatever way that is understood, but to really understand it as something that involves very, very complex imbrication. So we have here, I end this introduction, we have here a gentleman who in the span of just a few years transformed the anthropology of Christianity, really gave it a new face. Simultaneously, though, there was a kind of sequencing there. Transformed this new field, which some of you, if you're not working in the field of anthropology, may not be aware of this tectonic switch shift, but it is that. This new anthropology of morality, where Joel Robbins is truly one of the agents provocateurs, in the best sense of that term. And then also a scholar who's really providing us with a lot of insights into the comparative study of subjectivity. So it is with great pleasure, in short, and just pleasure and gratitude that I thank Professor Robbins for taking the time to come to us. He's had some personal family issues that make this trip all the more exceptional and something of a sacrifice on his part. So it was with great pleasure that we welcome you, thank you, and invite you to give the 5th annual Peter Berger Lecture on the Anthropology and Sociology of Religion. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thanks. It's really wonderful to be here. I want to thank Professor Hefner for that wonderful introduction, which I will now try to live down, and but also Professor Robert and everyone else who had a part in making it possible for me to be here. I was talking to some graduate students a couple of hours ago, and I've known this for a long time, having had a number of colleagues who have been students here, and then knowing a lot of scholars here and knowing the work of scholars I don't know personally. It seems to me that BU is a place where religion is taught across at least the social science and humanities curriculum with a kind of vigor and breadth that's really rare. So I was very, very excited to be able to give a chance to give this talk, but also to soak up some of the atmosphere here, which I had a chance to do earlier and hopefully afterwards. And anyway, I think it's quite remarkable how much goes on about religion at BU, and I'm really excited to be here to give you this talk, which is called What is the Matter with Transcendence on the Place of Religion in the New Anthropology of Ethics. This table turns. I may really give you the talk if I'm not careful. Okay. So as I've said, I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to deliver this lecture in honor of Peter Berger, though I've never met Professor Peter Berger. His work has had a place in my intellectual life for a very long time. His vision of the way in which social relations create and sustain the orders that give human life meaning is a fundamental social scientific framework that I've engaged closely with since I first encountered it as a student, and the sacred canopy and aroma of angels have played major roles in shaping my conception of religion. I guess I'm that generation that came when they were already part of the environment. You couldn't miss those works. More than that, the work he and others fostered through Cura and its earlier incarnations have been central in putting one of my main research areas, the global spread of Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity, on the contemporary scholarly agenda. I'm well aware of the history there, and in significant ways then, my intellectual life has followed along paths that Peter Berger and others here played a dominant role in laying out. So this fact makes the chance to travel a little further along one of these paths on this occasion an opportunity I'm really excited to take up. As it happens, though, the path I'm going to spend most of my time treading today is one that runs only tangentially through the explosive global growth of Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity. Later on in my talk, if you can hang out for the first half, I will turn to some of my own research with a small and remote group of charismatics in Papua New Guinea to illustrate the analytic potential of the argument I'm making. But the argument itself is not going to be about the nature of this important branch of the Christian tradition. Rather, what I want to consider today is the prospects for a specifically social scientific kind of argument about the relationship between morality and religion. An argument that, as will become clear, draws heavily on some aspects of Peter Berger's work. But before you imagine with some trepidation that in raising the question of the relationship between morality and religion, I've surely bitten off more than I or anyone else can chew in a single talk or before you prepare for a 4-hour disquisition, I should say right up front that I'm going to set aside the long-running debates on this subject in philosophy and theology, and until the end of my talk, I'm even going to give short shrift to the influential arguments bearing on this topic offered by the great founding figures of the social sciences. For my motivation to take up the problem of the relationship between morality and religion comes not from any of these venerable sources, but rather from what I see as an odd sidelining of religion in some influential recent attempts to move morality once more to the center of theoretical and empirical work in anthropology and sociology. My remarks today are thus an intervention in currently developing debates, and they respond in what I hope are constructive terms to what I see as some unfortunate terms that have marked their unfolding. I decidedly do not try to solve every problem ever raised concerning how we should think about the relationship between religion and morality. Okay, having rapidly narrowed my focus to a virtual pinpoint, let me start my argument proper by saying something about the recent interest in morality among anthropologists and sociologists. In these fields, the last decade or so has seen an impressive uptick in the number of scholars who have found themselves working on issues of morality and ethics and their role in social life. Professor Hefner mentioned this in the introduction. I'm not in a position to say anything definitive about why these topics have garnered such interest now, though it's interesting to note that at least in anthropology and in other fields such as literary studies, this ethical new wave is followed on the waning of a period during which a tendency to analyze all phenomena in relation to issues of power and politics broadly conceived was, to use the language of that older trend, dominant. Those, I meant that to be funny. Didn't know if I could deliver it right. Okay. Those still holding tight to the sharply focused political lens tend to see the turn to the study of ethics as a kind of cop-out, a retreat from the brave confrontation with life's harsh power political realities that our times demand. For their part, those who favor bringing people's ethical concerns more toward the center of our analyses retort that the reduction of human action to an expression of a will to power leaves us with such an etiolated image of how people work that we end up shedding almost no useful light on the lives they actually lead. This kind of opposition between views of human beings as largely political animals and those that see their behavior as woven from more complexly braided threads is, of course, an old one, and surely neither view can be right when framed in strident, one-sided terms. But for present purposes, it suffices to say that at this moment, the pendulum is swinging back toward the latter conception, the one that makes rooms for ethical concerns as a core feature of human motivation, and that an important index of this shift is the renewed place of the study of ethics across anthropology and sociology. When I originally proposed the topic for this talk, I thought I would try to speak as much about what Stephen Hitlin and Stephen Vasey call the new sociology of morality, part of the title of their annual review of sociology article. I hope to talk as much about the new sociology of morality as I would about developments in anthropology. As things have worked out, however, I think I will have to focus the critical parts of my remarks today most closely on anthropology, though I hope my constructive suggestions, which are woven as much from sociological sources as anthropological ones, might have some value for both fields. There are a few reasons for this further narrowing of my already drastically reduced focus. One is that I'm not sure the sociology of morality has produced quite as fulsome a predominant strain as has its anthropological counterpart. And it's this dominant strain in the anthropological work on which I'm going to focus my critical attention. I'll make that clear in a minute. But to be honest, the other reason for leaving sociology largely to one side in my critical remarks is I found it hard to get as strong a handle on the sociology of morality as I would have liked to. Some of this is surely due to my own limitations, but it might also point to the still rather diffuse nature of the field to which I've just alluded, that it's very new and kind of bubbling in a lot of directions, giving a critic little in the way of a clear target at which to aim. As I'm going to go on to explain now, the situation in anthropology has recently changed somewhat in this regard. Okay, so it is going to be the anthropology to which I turn with an eye toward making points that I hope are of broader social scientific relevance, as you'll see as I go on. As for anthropology, it's fair to say that the very rapid growth of interest in the study of ethics and morality has been one of the most notable recent developments in the field. From a marginal or at best background concern at the end of the last century, the study of ethics has come to approach the status of something like a key trend in the contemporary discipline. With an ambition to lead a major reassessment of many core aspects of social theory, and the promise to do so while opening up new horizons for ethnographic work by helping us attend to kinds of data we once ignored, the study of ethics has quickly generated interest quite broadly throughout anthropology. Indeed, cross-cutting subdisciplines and regional concerns, ethics is one of the few topics that is even a candidate to provide some unity to an increasingly fragmented field in which specialists more and more frequently struggle to find interest in work produced beyond their regional, topical, and theoretical borders. Having made its way to the main stage of a sprawling discipline, then, the study of ethics is set to make a significant mark on how anthropology is practiced for the foreseeable future. Now, it's fair to say that any trend that takes off as quickly as the anthropology of morality recently has must in the first instance welcome pretty much all comers. That is to say, it cannot require the mastery of complex theoretical positions or the collection of highly specialized kinds of data as conditions of entry. If you want to start a dominant trend in the social sciences, you have to make the costs of joining up very low. For much of the early takeoff period of the anthropology of morality, this condition was in place. Until recently, there's been no normal science in this area to stifle creativity and experiment or otherwise check any impulse someone might have to explore their material in moral terms. Those with an interest in Aristotle or ordinary language philosophy or the anthropological linguistic study of interaction or phenomenology or Foucault or the classical social theory of Durkheim and Weber could all make contributions, and they could do so while studying all manner of topics, from state-level politics to kinship, from gift-giving to lying, from sickness to healing, and from religious piety to cutting-edge business practices. To this point, the anthropology of ethics has pitched a broad tent, and it's surely in part its welcoming openness that's allowed it to do so in the disciplines centering all of those theoretical perspectives I mentioned, all of those topics and more that I listed have been canvassed by anthropologists, all within the last 10 years. So there's been this vigorous outpouring of activity. But recently I've begun to sense that the era marked by this radical openness might be drawing to a close, and now I'm getting to the heart of the critical remarks I want to make. In the last few years, more and more people who contribute to the anthropological study of ethics have come to define what they study as ordinary or everyday ethics. Ever since 2010, when Michael Lambeck edited a landmark volume with the title Ordinary Ethics, one sees that phrase and its near cognate, everyday ethics, with increasing frequency in the literature. They've become terms to conjure with, and this has been an important development, bringing some sense of theoretical progress to the anthropology of ethics to complement the wildly creative but in no sense cumulative tendencies that have marked its early years. The key claim of those who study ordinary and everyday ethics is that it is only in the minds of philosophers, theologians, and social theorists, all equally enthralled to the abstract, that morality involves things like rules, values, and sharply delineated images of the good. In real life, by contrast, ethics is a matter, we are told, of embodied habits, ingrained sensibilities, and a feel for how the game of social life should honorably be played. The closer we anthropologists stay to these usually unspoken and unelaborated foundations of ethical life, the argument goes, the better our research will be. There's a lot to say for this ordinary ethics point of view, for surely a good deal of ethical action takes the form of the performance of nearly automatic, small-scale gestures that keep social life running smoothly. An anthropological method has a long record of success in capturing these kinds of taken-for-granted aspects of social life. But every vantage point has its blind spots. And in what follows, I want to suggest that as it has developed to this point, the ordinary ethics paradigm has obscured the contribution of religion. Understood, we can understand this in Berger's terms as involving some reference to the transcendent, to ethics. The broadest claim I will be making is that leaving religion in the dark in this way has been a mistake in the development of the anthropology of ethics. Now, to be sure, religion and the transcendent are not necessarily the opposite of the ordinary and the everyday. But as an exercise, it's worth considering the way such standard antonyms to these latter terms, such as extraordinary, the exceptional, the unusual, do often point us to the sacred and the transcendent, and to religion more generally. And beyond these quick semantic observations, one can make this point in more grounded terms with a brief look at what have been by far the two most influential statements of the ordinary ethics position, which both develop a framework that effectively segregates the religious from the ethical, at least in the everyday sense. For the next 2 minutes, I'm going to look at these texts pretty closely, and I'm going to quote heavily from them. I'll resort to, I remember when my daughter was 7 years old, before she quite had learned the phonology of gesture, she would do this when she wanted to quote. I'm not ironizing, but I am quoting regularly because I want you to hear what these very influential articles sound like, because it's important to see what happens to religion here. So in his introduction to his volume of Ordinary Ethics, Michael Lambuck tells us that, quote, the ordinary implies an ethics that is relatively tacit, grounded in agreement rather than rule, in practice rather than knowledge or belief, and happening without calling undue attention to itself. Vina Das asserts in somewhat similar tones in an essay called Ordinary Ethics that what the anthropology of ethics calls for is, quote, a shift in perspective from thinking of ethics as made up of judgments we arrive at when we stand away from our ordinary practices to that of thinking of the ethical as a dimension of everyday life in which we are not aspiring to escape the ordinary, but rather to descend into it as a way of becoming moral subjects, close quote. From this point of view, ethical work, quote, is done not by orienting itself to, quote, not by orienting oneself to transcendental agreed upon values, but rather through the cultivation of sensibilities within the everyday. It's not difficult to detect, my voice now, even from these brief snippets of text, the binary scaffolding on which the sense of the everyday at work in them rests. The everyday is for the tasked against the explicit, the practiced against the known or believed, sensibility over values and rules, and the immanent over the transcendent. If we take all of the discarded terms together, the explicit, the known and believed, the codified rule, values, and the transcendent, it's hard to suspect that religion is an important part of what the everyday is not. And what ordinary ethics does not, to use a favorite expression of Vina Das, is leap over into. We're not going to leap into religion. The point that the everyday is decidedly not religious is even occasionally made explicit, at least in passing, in the text from which I've been quoting. Thus, in noting that ethics is ordinary because it is basic to human life, Lambuck suggests that, quote, it need not be singled out as an explicit category or department of human thought, nor constituted, as Morris Bloch sees religion and as some philosophers have seen metaphysics, at the expense of the ordinary. Lambuck then goes on to contrast everyday settings to contexts that at least sound religious, in which the ethical does become explicit, such as, quote, in prophetic movements of social and ethical renewal, and among priestly classes attempting to rationalize and educate. And turning again to Das, one of her aims is to show, quote, how dramatic enactments of ethical value, as in publicly performed rituals, are grounded within the normative practices of everyday life. Here, religious ritual is secondary, and more generally in ordinary ethics, a turn to religion on the part of people we study has a slight tinge of a fall from grace. Religion, with its supposed habits of distanced reflection, love of explicitly formulated rules and values, and a tendency to speak in imperative tones, is only necessary for those who somehow cannot work out their ethical lives in the comfortable immanence of the everyday. A harshly lit realm of imposing codified demands, rather than quiet, smoothly unfolding skilled practice, the transcendent comes off from the ordinary point of view as an agent of rough justice at best and as a source of profound alienation from truly ethical living at worst. The goal of my argument from here on out is to suggest that this is not a fair account of the religious or the transcendent. I may not need to stress that too strongly here, but that's my goal for the moment. For one thing, people really do sometimes stand back from the flow of their lives. It's the kind of thing that as human beings they can do, and often enough they resort to it. Such standing back, I want to suggest, is not less basic to people's ethical existence than their ability to participate in the flow of everyday life. And for another thing, what humans learn from such exercises of standing back from or leaping out of the everyday can, pace das, inform their everyday ethics at least as much as it is grounded in them. For these reasons, I think the anthropological study of ethics would be impoverished if it were reduced to the study only of its ordinary, everyday forms. And in fact, maybe the everyday itself does not make sense without some attention to the religious and the transcendent as well. I'm going to develop my argument along these lines in two steps. In the first, I want to present, in part drawing on Berger's work, an understanding of religion that is at least in part, an understanding of religion as at least in part a matter of the transcendent, and more importantly, to offer an image of the transcendent that is not as fearsome, neither as metaphysically alienating nor as fiercely demanding as it often appears to be from an ordinary ethics point of view. Then, in the second part, or the second step, I want to look at one form of transcendent religious representation, the representation of values produced by ritual, to begin to sketch a picture of how religion informs ethical life in ways that do not explain away or traduce its everyday qualities, but that at the same time do not leave them to stand wholly on their own. So that's where I'm headed. And let me start then by talking about the transcendent. Our English word transcendence is derived from Latin terms that mean to surpass or to go beyond. Merriam-Webster Online suggests that current usage stays close to these roots, offering as the first two glosses exceeding usual limits, surpassing, and extending or lying beyond the limits of ordinary experience. The sense in which the transcendent is defined in opposition to the everyday is evident here. Terms like exceeding and surpassing certainly can be taken to carrying with them a sense of the elevated, the excessive, or the magisterial that ordinary ethicists point to when painting the transcendent as awe-inspiring and commanding in ways that block the desirable flow of the everyday. But I do not think these terms must be taken in that way, and it is a one-sided emphasis on the imposing quality of the transcendent that I want to dial back here, though not mute entirely. Put more positively, I want to foreground a kindler, gentler side of the transcendent that we might take to enrich rather than destroy the everyday, even as it does not collapse into it. A good starting point for reconsidering the nature of the transcendent in the way I want to here is the work of Alfred Schutz, a well-known social philosopher and one of Peter Berger's key teachers, of course. Drawing on the phenomenological tradition, Schutz argues that transcendence is inescapable in human life. This is so because there are always things that are important to us that are outside our immediate perceptual experience, but that we can represent to ourselves by means of various kinds of signs. Based on the different ways in which we represent such perceptually absent things to ourselves, Schutz lays out three categories of transcendence: the little, the medium, and the great. We're definitely in the realm of the kindler and gentler already, aren't we? Little transcendencies are those in which the transcendent item is presently beyond our immediate perceptual experience, but could have been part of that experience in the past, and may be so again in the future. So when I leave the living room to enter the kitchen, the living room is now transcendent in relation to my immediate experience, but I can always turn back and make it present once again. Middle transcendencies, for sure, are other people, whom we realize have an inner life like our own, which we can never experience directly. Thus, the inner experience of my friends can never be present to me the way the living room can, but should suggest that it is still the case that we often feel we overcome this gap between us. Therefore, Schutz asserts that the little and the medium transcendencies are alike, and that, to put it in his terms, the boundaries of experience that are being crossed are everyday ones, and the crossing themselves are likewise everyday ones. By contrast, he says, the great transcendencies, which include religion, as well as theoretical thinking and dreaming. I like the fact that he brackets theoretical thinking and dreaming together as I launch into my theoretical disposition here. The great transcendencies involve objects we realize we can never experience directly in everyday terms. If we want to experience such great transcendencies in their immediacy, rather than just represent them to ourselves with signs, we have to leave everyday life, or what Schutz in Husserlian terms calls the natural attitude, and take on an unnatural attitude in which we step back from our normal practical motives and structures of relevance. I know that this Schutz is very abstract, and I'm going to move beyond him quickly, but what I like in what he's doing is he's starting from very basic human operations of living with things we know are beyond our immediate experience, and building from those all the way up to what he's calling these great transcendencies. On Schutz's model, then, we are entangled in transcendence all the time. So transcendence itself is nothing special. As he notes, and this statement I think is worth pondering more thoroughly than I'm able to here for what he suggests about how to think about the everyday, without representation of transcendent phenomenon, what he calls appresentations, quote, a person would remain to a considerable extent caught within the limits of the flux of actually present experiences, without appresentations themselves completely caught. There would be life and lived experiences, perhaps even encounters, but no life world emphasized. So the everyday is shot through, even constituted in large part, by transcendence. But even so, the great transcendencies, and religion among them, do in experiential terms take us beyond the everyday. They build on very basic human experiential and representational capacities, but to produce effects that, we might say, are not themselves quite so basic. Unfortunately, Schutz does not give us much of a sense of the kinds of things that are experienced or represented in the great transcendencies, at least in the reading I've done in him over the years. He may have been a little, as Berger put it about himself, but was probably wrong, religiously unmusical. He doesn't tell us much about what's going on in the great transcendencies. For this, I want to suggest we should turn to Peter Berger's arguments about what he calls the signals of transcendence that anchor religion and human experience. And he's clearly influenced by Schutz in this argument. For present purposes, I'm going to set aside the theological context in which Berger first made his claims. I'm interested rather in the account he gives of the way signals of transcendence point beyond the normal everyday world, his terms, even relativize the claims that world makes to represent what the novelist William Kennedy once called the only cosmos in town, but do so in ways that are not overpowering or wholly destructive of people's attachment to the lives they live every day. In fact, as with Schutz, Berger sees these signals of transcendence as being produced by means of what he calls prototypical human gestures that constitute ordinary kinds of human behavior, even as they open windows to worlds that are other than ordinary. In A Rumor of Angels, he lists 5 kinds of human action that generate such signals: the effort to order reality and the tendency to trust in the orders that result, the experience of play, the feeling of hope, the spontaneous conviction that some actions are damnable, and humor. That's the list he goes through. It would take the rest of this lecture to explore the different ways each of these gestures points to the transcendent. And since I'm going to give my own detailed example of how this can be accomplished in a moment, I'm not even going to start down that track. I'm not going to further unpack my argument. But I do want to point out that Berger explicitly notes that his list is not exclusive. This is important for me because I want to suggest one more widespread human gesture we might add to Berger's list, one that will eventually bring us to an argument about one kind of link between religion and morality. The novel signal of transcendence I want to propose here is the encounter with fully realized versions of important cultural values in the course of ritual performance. There's a lot to unpack here. I know that's kind of for a payoff sentence that's a little bit complex. There's a lot to unpack here, not least what I mean by fully realized version of a value. But before I get down to work on elaborating my argument, I want to point out that in connecting values to the transcendent in this way, I find myself once again in the company of the ordinary ethicists whose work I discussed earlier. The Das claims that values belong to the transcendent and then argues that it's precisely for this reason the ordinary needs to be defined against them. And Lambeck also states explicitly that values are not, as he conceives of things, part of what he's going to call the substance of ethics. I'm happy to follow our ordinary ethical authorities in conceiving values as at least sometimes having a transcendent character, but not, as you might expect, in going on to suggest that they are for that reason not central to ethical life. A key goal of my argument for the rest of this paper is to overcome the suggestion that they are. So that I've taken my first step. I've kind of rethought transcendence. I've tried to make it a little less of an alienating, obviously bad space to be in. Now I want to start to think about ritual, values, and transcendence. And this is the last part of the paper that also finally has some ethnographic data in it. The older I get, the longer it takes me to get to my ethnography. I don't know what that means, but at least I'm very patient. For present purposes, I will define values as representations of the good, what people take to be, all things considered, desirable. That is to say, whether or not people at every moment desire the things values represent, they do acknowledge in a second-order way that these things are worth desiring. They know, to put it in terms that bear more centrally on issues of ethics, that it is good to desire them. You may not always desire something that's valuable, but you will acknowledge that it would be a good thing to desire it. And since values elicit desires or are tied up with desires, they also have an attractive quality. They can pull people in the direction of moral concern and ethical action. Having defined values in this way, I should add that my claim is not that people are always thinking about or practically in the grip of important cultural values in the everyday, ordinary course of things. Sometimes during the flow of everyday life, the ethical desires that values are capable of awakening are not to the fore of our consciousnesses. Yet people can still, on later reflection, appreciate the desirability of those values. This is one sense in which we can say values at times transcend ordinary experience. We can look back and say, it would have been good to have been a little more patient with that person. But in the moment of experience, that value was outside of the ken. In the everyday moment, that value was outside the ken of our experience, so transcendent. But there's also a second reason it makes sense to talk about values as transcendent. This is the more important one for me as I build toward talking about ritual. In all social systems, as I have argued elsewhere, drawing on the work of Max Weber, Isaiah Berlin, and Louis Dumont, I got some authorities lined up for this one. Values at times can come into conflict with one another. Drawing on those, values in every society, values at times come into conflict with one another. To take a case I happen to have at hand from some recent reading, many people who were liberal elite university students in the United States in the late 1930s up through 1940, having grown up in the long shadow of World War I, felt very strongly attached to the values of peace and justice. The question of whether the United States should remain isolationist or enter World War II became a problem for them when these two values came into conflict, raising issues of when peace could be abandoned for the sake of justice and when it could not. I just happened to read that in something in passing, and I come late enough to all of that, having known how World War II unfolded, that I always had trouble sympathizing with the pacifist argument, the isolationist argument for World War II. So that reading struck me. But that's a clear conflict of values. If peace and justice line up, we're fine. If they don't, when can you give up peace for justice? That clash of values is quite dramatic, but we are all familiar with others that are less so, both from our own lives and from our research. In academic settings like this, I sometimes illustrate this point by reminding people of the clash of American values of honesty and politeness that sometimes arise when a speaker asks what we thought of their lecture. You remember that? Or drawing on a more classic anthropological observation, I bring up the conflict people in many places regularly experience between realizing values tied to their relations with in-laws and those tied to their relations with kin, which is a just constantly reiterated theme in ethnography, which is of course about different kind of values, the values of what anthropologists call affinity and those of dissent. Because value conflicts like these, both relatively gentle and sometimes more severe, frequently beset the realization of values in everyday life, and this is crucial, we rarely find single values represented in very full or coherent form there. In the face of the conflicting pulls of values in the everyday, we mostly muddle along without sorting out fully what any one value really looks like or demands of us. We're a little bit polite, a little bit honest, but rarely wholly either one. But if conflicts between values and the compromises they tend to require of social actors mean we do not usually experience their full force of any one value in the course of ordinary living, where in our experience do we encounter them? If most of our life we're dealing with sort of compromised versions of values, where do we even come to experience what their full force would be like? I want to suggest one place we run into this force is in the course of religious rituals that touch on the transcendent by representing fully realized versions of specific values. I base and now I'm going to work really clearly for like 1.5 minutes through some pretty heavy ritual theory. I'm happy to unpack this in questions, but the choice was to leave it out entirely or go quickly, so I decided to go quickly. I base my argument that rituals allow people to encounter and realize single values in unusually complete form on a synthesis of two important branches of ritual studies that I'm going to call the representational and the performative streams. Okay, working quickly, let's say that representational theories are those that focus on the ability ritual has to represent aspects of the social world in unique ways. To remind ourselves of what core assertions of representational theories of ritual sound like, we can recall the anthropologist Roberto D'Amato's argument that rituals provide, quote, a dramatization of certain elements, values, ideologies, and relationships in a society in a way that brings to light aspects of people's social life, still quoting him, normally submerged by everyday routines, interests, indifferences, and other similar complications. Or consider the anthropologist Don Handelman's suggestion that it is in ritual that, quote, cultural codes, usually diffuse, attenuated, or submerged in the mundane order of things, lie closest to the behavioral surface. Or finally, moving beyond anthropology to religious studies, we can take note of Jonathan Z. Smith's definition of ritual, quoting him here, as a means of performing the way things ought to be in conscious tension to the way things are, in such a way that this ritualized perfection is recollected in the ordinary, uncontrolled course of things. As these brief state accounts demonstrate, D'Amato, Handelman, and Smith all suggest that rituals accomplish a kind of clarifying of social representations that people often only vaguely or incompletely apprehend in everyday life. And I could cite a lot more anthropologists making arguments that sound very close to this. To this kind of argument, I would add only the specification already anticipated explicitly by D'Amato that one kind of representation rituals routinely present in clear, or we might say fully elaborated forms, is that of values. Rituals frequently achieve such clear representations of values because, I'm arguing, they suspend or dramatically overcome the complex and often conflicting relations that hold between values in everyday life, and instead aim to realize one value to the fullest extent possible. I'm not saying that every single ritual ever performed by humanity does this, but I think a lot of them do. And the representational theories, I think, encourage us to recognize that rituals present fully realized values in this way, but it's the performative theories of ritual, I think, that help us explain how they're able to do this. So let me just talk for a quick moment about performative theories. Performative theories of ritual, to simplify matters significantly, hold that like all performative acts, they're drawing on speech act theory here. Like all performative acts, rituals bring things about by the simple fact of their performance. Okay? Because this is so, if I say I promise to meet you in 2 hours, I have brought about the existence of that promise in the world. I'm not just referring to it, I've made it happen. So because rituals, like performative speech acts, bring about the very things that they describe, and because they do that, and here I'm going to follow the influential performative argument of Roy Rappaport, those who participate in a ritual commit themselves to accomplishing whatever the ritual is understood to performatively bring about. In making such commitments to realizing ritual outcomes, I'm suggesting that people also commit to and experience the process of realizing the values these outcomes embody. If we participate in a healing rite, for example, we commit to the notion that it is valuable or good for the patient for whom the rite is held to be well. We can't participate in the rite without committing to that value. Because each ritual, as a performative action, commits those who participated to the achievement of a particular goal, each of them also at least presupposes and often explicitly expresses the value that this goal realizes. That is why rituals tend to offer such clear representations of the values they express, and why they provide their performers with opportunities to realize single values quite fully. And now, you will be relieved to know that I'm thinking I could make this point about rituals and values more clear by turning to two examples of rituals drawn from my own fieldwork. So a little ethnography now. I'm going to draw from my fieldwork among the Irapman of the West Sepik province of Papua New Guinea to try to illustrate these points about ritual and value I've been making. The Irapman are a remote group of about 400 people, first colonized only in the late 1940s, who were never directly missionized by Westerners. In the 1960s, they sent young people out to learn about Christianity from their neighbors who had had significant contact with Australian Baptist missionaries. Then, during a revival that swept Papua New Guinea in the late 1970s, all of the Irapman converted to a globally recognizable form of charismatic Christianity. By the time I arrived in Irapman to do fieldwork in the early 1990s, all Irapman people saw themselves as living in a completely Christian community, and the effort to achieve Christian salvation was at the center of much of their public and private lives. As I discussed it now, obviously there's a whole long story there that I'm not going to be able to tell. I'd be happy to talk about it in questions, but You're just going to take my word for it. It's the short version. As I've discussed in detail elsewhere, among the Iraqman, Christian morality as they understand it has come into conflict with their own traditional moral thinking. In the traditional moral thought, which as we might expect is critically tied to the workings of their social order, aggressive self-interested behavior the Iraqman call willful is valued to some extent, provided it is balanced by what they define as lawful behavior, oriented toward the also valuable goal of meeting the legitimate expectations and demands of others. That both willfulness and lawfulness are valued in their traditional understanding. Even after conversion, the context of much of Iraqman social life continues in traditional ways to demand both willful and lawful conduct. This demand is rendered problematic, however, by the fact that Iraqman Christian morality defines all willful feelings and actions as sinful, and it enjoins people only to have and act on lawful thoughts and feelings if they want to be saved. The goal of Iraqman Christians is therefore to cultivate what they call an easy or quiet heart filled with good thinking that will lead them to live lawful Christian lives. Sort of like I did with Lambeck and Vina Das, I'm using a lot of Iraqman terms here, but moving quickly to give you a sense of the feel of the way they talk and how I'm getting from that to my analysis. So they talk about easy and quiet hearts filled with good thinking that lead to a lawful Christian life. That all requires lawfulness and a complete disregard or banishment of the will. Given the traditional Christian morality conflict in Iran, and the people there still need to rely on traditional patterns of moral action in many of the key contexts of everyday life, their lives are marked by a strenuous conflict between the values of willfulness and lawfulness. Ordinary sociality rarely provides the setting in which Iraqmen feel they've resolved this conflict, and this leads them to define themselves as deeply sinful people, too much given to answering the promptings of the value of willfulness. But in their Christian rituals, they regularly do endeavor to create images of uncompromised lawfulness and to perform such lawfulness for themselves. To illustrate this point and support my larger theoretical argument about the ways rituals allow people to encounter and perform fully realized versions of important values that often appear only in fragmentary form in everyday life, I want to consider two important Iraqman Christian rites. And I'm going to start with the one the Iraqmen practice more frequently, and that is the Sunday morning church service. Now, church services may sound like fairly humble rituals, but it's worth knowing that Iraqmen hold church services very regularly, sometimes even twice daily. So they spend a lot of time in church services. Of all services, however, those on Sunday morning are the best attended and are treated as important community-wide events. For this reason, I will focus on the Sunday morning service, though my analysis would fit other services as well. The Iraqman Sunday service aims, as I have foreshadowed, at realizing the core Christian value of lawfulness. In order to understand how it accomplishes this, it's important to realize that it also allows for and gives ritual expression to the opposed value of willfulness. In fact, the church service can't escape doing this, I want to suggest, because its overall temporal structure is constructed so as to enact the lawful overcoming of the will. So it must display willfulness in its very design. Earlier on, I said often dramatically overcome value conflict. Rituals often so I think this ritual actually dramatizes the conflict between willfulness and lawfulness and then resolves it in favor of lawfulness. And we can see the importance of willfulness, not lawfulness to the right, even before it begins, in the way Iraqmen talk about the process by which people come to participate in it. In order to take part in the Sunday service, people must come, as the Iraqmen put it, inside the church. The inside-outside opposition is an important one for Iraqman Christianity. It is inside the church, or as they sometimes say, inside God's fence, like pen pigs prevented from destroying human gardens, or inside the Christian life, that people are best able to maintain easy hearts and practice lawfulness. As soon as people go outside, as the Iraqmen put it, the church, as soon as people go outside the church or jump God's fence and go outside of Christian life, they enter a world in which it's very difficult not to sin. Given this understanding of the inside-outside opposition, we can interpret what Iraqmen mean by coming inside the church for service as leaving the everyday and its value conflicts behind. Lost in this way, it should not come as a surprise that Iraqmen do not always find it easy to enter the church. Service begins when the pastor rings the bell to call people to come. There are always a few people who respond quickly, come inside the church, and begin to sing hymns. But most Sunday mornings, many other people feel too caught up in matters of the outside to make a quick break from it when they hear the bell. They dawdle over eating, dressing up, finishing conversations, or other matters that anchor them in the everyday. This difference in response ensures that almost all church services begin with a confrontation between lawfulness, as evidenced by the behavior of the bell-ringing pastor in church before anyone else, and the early responders to his call, and those who straggled in late. Those already in attendance grumble about the willfulness of the latecomers and charge them with wasting the time for church. Because the allotment count anger as a sin, their complaining counts as willful in itself, while it at the same time highlights the willfulness of those who have arrived late or who have not yet arrived at all. By means of this regular repeated scenario, almost every Sunday morning, there are people who are there early who begin complaining about the people who are not there yet. By means of this regular repeated scenario, even the process of beginning a service unfolds as a struggle between the values of lawfulness and willfulness. But once everyone's come inside, marking a first victory for lawful comportment, the service proper begins with a prayer, offered by someone nominated by the pastor. These prayers inevitably include statements about human willfulness and the way it pushes people to sin, and then describes the purpose of the church service as allowing people to receive God's word in their heart so that they can become lawful. Your Rotman prayers often are kind of a meta-commentary on what's going on or what's about to go on. The opening prayer is followed by hymn singing and then a period given over to speeches by local politicians known as big men. These speeches take up outside matters such as disputes or the difficulties facing one or other major collective project, and the discussions they initiate are often marked by willfulness and anger. They also thus represent another expression of willfulness in the midst of the church, which people often say these big men bring outside things inside, yet they're always given time and they always do this. But once the speeches of the big men and the discussions around them are finished and someone has offered another prayer, the pastor begins his sermon. Sermons are the structural center of the Rotman church service, and they mark the moment during the rite at which willfulness begins to be definitively overcome. As the prayer before the sermon is spoken, attention shifts to the pulpit of the front of the church, the part of the church most identified with lawfulness, for only those known to be free from recent willful sins can preach or sit as deacons on the raised platform on which the pulpit rests. And the big men who bring outside matters always sit at the very back of church, despite their very high station in society, which would, in other respects, make you think they would wind up at the front. Like the opening prayer, your Rotman sermons always, in one way or another, dwell on the importance of lawfulness and the suppression of the will. More than this, they often explicitly address the way in which listening to the sermon in the correct manner itself counts as lawful behavior, while poor attention is willful. Here's an example of explicit preaching on this issue taken from a Sunday sermon. So this is the Rotman preacher, a young one. This isn't the most artful expression of it, but it's very clear. You come inside and you look at each other. You look over to your friend, he looks back at his friend, you move your head around, turn your head from side to side. If you do that, if you're making noise, you won't be able to receive God's talk. God's talk will not be bound in your heart. Just come in quietly and sit down, and whatever kind of man is giving talk or news, you think about it and you be peaceful. Then Jesus will come and take you. You Christian people, you yourselves will get heaven, God's kingdom. Both in representational content then and in the nature of its correct audition, the sermon portion of the service focuses on the value of lawfulness. The sermon is sometimes followed by a period in which various members of the congregation support its message by reiterating what the pastor has said about the need for lawfulness and its link to salvation. Then there comes a final prayer. This prayer is distinguished from all others in the service by the fact that after a prayer leader is chosen by the pastor and begins to pray, everyone in the congregation prays loudly at the same time, creating a cacophonous roar of simultaneous voices that eventually fall away, leaving the prayer leader alone to conclude by naming each of the families in attendance and asking one by one that God bless them all. People then stand up and begin milling around the church and shaking hands, a highly significant lawful gesture in your Rotman life. Generally, you have to shake hands with everybody you see the first time you see them in a day, or you can actually be taken to the village court. So at the end of the trip, everybody goes and shakes everybody's hand. And this final act of the rite can last a long time, for each person is careful to shake the hand of everyone else in attendance, realizing in highly visible form the goal of universal lawfulness. The mood during this time is notably light, as the Rotman would put it, and relaxed. It has about it something of Durkheim's ritual effervescence, a quality missing for most of the rest of the service, during which the struggle between willful and lawful values is more disruptively to the fore. As I've noticed, so I'd like you to remember that final image of this handshaking and peaceful coexistence. As I've noticed, your Rotman understand the realization of lawfulness as the key to achieving Christian salvation. Given this, it is perhaps not surprising that the rite of the Sunday church service is only one among several ritual means they have for encountering and realizing this value. Indeed, the goal of the majority of the Christian rites Robin undertake is to bolster people's commitment to and accomplishment of this kind of lawfulness. Among these, the rite the Robin find most exciting and efficacious is the one they call the spirit dance, or in talk pigeon, the spirit disco. Disco just meaning dance. For all of it, I really liked working through the church service because that's a pretty humble ritual. If you were to sit through it and not have sat through lots and lots and lots of them and then come home and try to analyze it, you'd have trouble drawing a lot from it. This one hits you much more in the face, and this next ritual is much more arresting and gets your attention, and it does for the Robin too. But for all its singular dramatic effect, the spirit dance is ultimately much like the more mundane Sunday service. Both stage the full realization of the value of lawfulness in the face of its struggle with the value of willfulness. But the spirit dance stands at the apex of the Robin ritual life, because it not only allows people to enact lawfulness in a highly elaborated form, but it also clears away from the hearts of its performers the residues that are left by willful sins they have committed in the past, in a way I'll explain as I go through the rite. Spirit dances are circular dances performed at night inside the church. Most members of the church attend when one is held. During the dance, some of the dancers become possessed by the Holy Spirit. Once this happens, they begin to flail widely and will be controlled by other dancers who hold them and do their best to prevent them from hurting themselves or others. During a successful dance, several people will become possessed in this way for up to an hour. At the height of the rite, the scene inside the church can be chaotic, with all the possessed people careening unpredictably around the room as others struggle to keep up the circular pattern of the dance. It's hard to convey this I have longer descriptions of this elsewhere in my work, but we're almost done here. But the church is not as big as this room. There's no electricity in your Robin. These are done at night, so it's dark. Some people have brought in, they've lit resin stove torches. And people are careening all over the floor of the church, which is up on slats and has a bark floor, is breaking, and people are throwing bits of the floor out the window, and then people are tripping on the gaps, and the possessed people are really hurtling all over the place. So it's very, very, very chaotic. And during this period, the rite is in practice an image of willfulness given full play, as possessed people act with no regard for the lawful treatment of others. And as we'll see in a minute, the theology of this rite is that it is actually the sins in them that are fighting with the Holy Spirit, and that's what's producing all of this violence. Eventually, the Spirit will leave the possessed dancers one by one. When the Spirit leaves a dancer, he or she collapses on the floor, completely limp, unconscious, and as the Robins see it, at peace. After possession, people will lie on the church floor in the state for some time as the dancers slow down and eventually stop. Participants remain with those who were once possessed until they regain normal consciousness. Then everyone will pray together and the ritual ends. In your Robin understanding, the violence of possession during the spirit dance is due to a battle within the possessed person's heart between the Holy Spirit and his or her sins caused by their prior willful behavior. Possession ends when the spirit finally succeeds in throwing out the person's sin from his or her body. Before commencing the spirit dance, everyone must confess their sins to a pastor or deacon who will pray over them and tell God the sins have been given to him. But it is only during the spirit dance and the possession that is central to it that the sins, conceived as leaving a kind of physical residue inside the person, are finally removed from the body. This leaves the person ready for salvation. As the Robins see it, the previously possessed person lying still and alone on the church floor represents the full realization of the saved individual beyond the promptings of willfulness. They're in complete repose. They don't display any kind of willfulness. Since, as one person once crystallized the general understanding to me, quote, once people leave the church building, they will start sinning again. Here's the inside-outside business again. Or they will, to put it otherwise, be caught again in the sinful snares of trying to realize the traditional value of willfulness alongside the Christian and traditional value of lawfulness. It's only at this moment inside the church at the end of the rite that one can be sure of one's own or someone else's salvation. It is thus the only time in your Robin life that the state of becoming a wholly lawful person, unencumbered by the residues of past sins and worthy of salvation, is fully realized. The spirit dance, then, presents an example of the value of Christian lawfulness worked out in its fullest form. I'm almost done now. I really am, actually. At the end of my discussion of the Sunday service, I noted that the handshaking that concludes the rite has an effervescent quality. Frenetic and wholly involving, the spirit dance has more of this quality throughout its course, but for most of the rite, the effervescent mood is compromised by a sense of tension caused by the willful violence of the proceedings. For this reason, it's only at the end of that rite, too, when people recognize that all the possessions have concluded, that the sense of Durkheimian effervescence finally settles wholly on the participants. I would suggest that effervescence peaks at the end of both the Sunday service and the spirit dance, because these are the moments when willfulness has been definitively vanquished and lawfulness has finally come to full expression. I would extend this point by suggesting that Durkheimian effervescence more generally may be precisely what it feels like to realize a value fully, to realize a value in its transcendent form, rather than in the truncated, often compromised forms in which one realizes them, if one realizes them at all, in ordinary life. As it happens, Durkheim came pretty close to making this argument himself. In order to consider how he does so, I turn to a short concluding section where the main issue I want to take up is how this foray into the transcendent realm, as it appears through the window of religious ritual, might inform our consideration of ethics, even in its everyday, ordinary forms. So here's a 1.5-minute conclusion called Back to Ordinary Ethics. Victor Turner actually has analyzed rituals as expressions of values usually present only in fragmented forms in daily life in terms strikingly similar to those I suggested here. I could have given you a paper where I just went through his argument step by step, because in a paper I'd read many times as a graduate student and was shocked to recently rediscover when I read it for teaching purposes, the whole argument is there. That would have been a much more intellectual history sounding kind of exercise, but he's made nearly the same argument. And in the midst of his argument, he reminds us that, quote, Durkheim was fascinated by the problem of why many social norms and imperatives were felt to be at the same time obligatory and desirable. Turner doesn't give a reference here, but he must be alluding to Durkheim's 1906 piece, The Determination of Moral Facts, written on the way to the writing of the elementary forms of the religious life. It's in that essay that Durkheim takes issue with Kant in a way that is crucial for our understanding of his approach to ethics. Against the Kantian emphasis on the demandingness of moral norms, Durkheim argues that moral ends cannot be a matter only of duty or obligation. They must also be, quote, desirable and desired. If they're not desirable, Durkheim asserts, no one will act on them. A sense of duty is not enough to mobilize human action. The desirability of values, Durkheim goes on to suggest, is produced by experiences of the sacred, and therefore of society and of collective sentiments that transcend the individual. Soon, of course, we're in the territory of Durkheim's famous later argument about the ritual production of effervescence and its role in making society something people feel is greater than, and even better than, themselves. In the Moral Facts essay, though, he doesn't go quite that far. There, the key point is not the divinization of society, but rather that the socially derived power of the sacred makes values themselves, rather than society more generally, an object of desire. My intention here is to bring Berger's notion of signals of transcendence into dialogue with Durkheim's account of how the unusual, uplifting energy of collective sociality creates such desirability, in order to argue that the ways ritual allows people to touch and even perform values in their fullest forms, forms that transcend their usual appearance in the ordinary course of things, enables the desirability of single values to gain a grip on people that it rarely manages to maintain in everyday life. But, and this is where I want to bring my argument to rest, even in the course of everyday life, some of the desirability of single values that is produced in transcendent encounters with them must surely still be felt. In the everyday, persons do not, for reasons we've discussed, often attempt to realize single value-linked desires fully. But the pushes and pulls different single values exert give everyday life much of its sense of forward movement, or at least of ethical potential. Although Doss holds out some hope of making habit central to everyday moral accomplishment, she, and even more so Michael Lambeck and James Laidlaw, who I haven't discussed very much, I haven't discussed previously in this essay, see reflection as a key component of ordinary ethics. What I've hoped to indicate here at the end of my argument is that it is the sometimes insistent but often rather more general ethical desires that the transcendent experience of values and ritual sets in play that tip us into reflection and drive the evaluative impulses that saturate ordinary life. Ultimately, these desires and the moral energies they generate have their roots in the sometimes but not always friendlier face of transcendence I've tried to bring into view here. but their forces are felt far from the transcendent realm in which they're produced. Without moving theoretical work on religion to the center of the social scientific study of ethics, this is a crucial aspect of the moral life I think we're likely to miss. Thanks. I always take that clapping at the end, by the way, as a ritual realization of the value of politeness and humility. And now comes the honesty. Yeah.
Thank you for a fascinating paper. I work in religious ethics, and so think about these things from a slightly different angle. And I guess I wonder somewhat, while being really sympathetic to what I think you're trying to do, I wonder somewhat to what extent you might remain within the very binary that you're trying to overcome. And let me make that a little more concrete. So the idea that religious rituals reproduce or inculcate or realize a single value, that seems doubtful. So if we take the case of, say, the Eucharist, what would be the single value? Is it love, forgiveness, unity, fellowship, hospitality, generosity? And I think we could give a similar roster for any number of rituals. And I don't know what it would ever mean to say that we've hit on the single value of a given ritual. And to the extent that one does make that single value claim, I think that falls into what the everyday ethics folks are trying to resist, because it has about it an aura of artificiality and separation from the messiness of life. So I wonder, I guess I'm asking about the single value realization of rituals, even if maybe it's possible that there is a ritual here or there, some rituals that do that specific work. But isn't it the case in general that rituals realize a multiplicity of values? And isn't it partly the case that part of what religion does as it inculcates itself into disposition and practices is enables a sensitivity to that multiplicity of values and the warp and woof of everyday life? That at least is how someone in a virtue ethics tradition might think of this.
Well, that's really, I was thinking of one way of answering your question until the very end, and then at the very end, so I'll start with that one at the very end. And it's a great question and takes the argument on the ground. I think it's really most important to take it, which is in some sense as an empirical claim about rituals. I would be interested ethnographically, and I don't know this for the Eucharist itself, but if you study people telling you what they thought the Eucharist accomplished, if they maybe wouldn't come up with a list quite as long as yours. If depending on the tradition they're coming from, things might tell you it's love or generosity or try to give you a sense that those are all part of one big, that they belong together in some way. But that's an empirical claim, and it is completely falsifiable. So I'm trying to make you are right that I stay, and I think that's very astute, that in some ways, in order to argue with the everyday ethicists, I'm staying within their dichotomy. But more than just in order to argue with them, I do think, and this is again just a claim about how values work, that most of the time values are pretty confused and compromised. So I do kind of want to set apart those situations in which they get pulled apart and sort of realized singly. Whether ritual always, regularly, sometimes, never does that, and how often it would have to do it for my claim to be worth much, is a great empirical question. But I would be interested to know from other people who've done ethnography to what extent. Often you do find rituals dramatizing a lot of values, but I think partially because of this goal-directed performative quality, they often realize one sort of more fully than that. That's the stakes. But so so I think it's exactly the right question. All I can do is I was sort of really, I'm reassured is too strong a word, pleased to see that Victor Turner made a very similar one. It's not maybe it's not completely far-fetched, but I do, so that, but the point about virtue ethics at the end too is I know that one of the tensions in virtue ethics is whether all virtues are kind of composable with each other, whether you can work them into a hierarchy, whether they all support each other, or whether being virtuous in one way can lead to a failure of virtue in another scale of virtue. And I'm definitely coming from the side that sees conflict as between values or virtues, and that sets up this whole argument about there being two different kinds of possibilities, the kind of messy, contradictory, and then the clearer, more.
I would just briefly append that that may sit uneasily with religious traditions that want to assert precisely the ultimate unity of these various values.
Yeah. Yes, and I mean, it may be that part of our intuition that maybe a ritual could express a lot of values would come out of the idea that the religious tradition has a whole host of values. That's a very good point. And again, ethnographically, I'd want to see if the people practicing the rituals did feel that they were a little bit different than everyday life, and partially in terms of a kind of clarity of their goals. But these are, I mean, they're exactly the perfect questions. And I'm not claiming to answer them, just saying what I'd have to say to make the argument worth keep trying with. Yeah.
As part of our ritual
Yeah.
effervescence, if as you ask your question, if you could identify yourself, this is a celebration of the diversity of the community of people interested in religion at Boston University, and I think all of us always enjoy just hearing that. So
Yeah.
if you could just append that to your question, be grateful.
That's David. David DeCosimo, School of Theology, Graduate Division of Religion.
Great. Thank you.
And an ethicist.
David Frankfurter, Department of Religion.
Oh, everybody's named David. Hi,
I think we have around here.
Yeah.
I was wondering, as I was listening to you, how much the connection between the religion, transcendence, and ritual was bound to a fundamentally Protestant understanding of religion and religion and culture. I work on antiquity and Christianization, especially
Yeah.
in the East,
Yeah.
Orthodoxy, where ritual really has a very different function. And also in late antiquity in general, ritual, whether Eucharistic or sacramental in the West or in the East, introduces the divine world into the human world. So it's really not a kind of a dramatization of values that people want because they couldn't possibly relate to it. So I was trying to, it was actually your point about Durkheim at the end that made me realize, okay, well, for people's values outside of these rituals, they probably are engaging, they have a sense of transcendent, a sense of what is desirable, and things like that. But in terms of their relationship to Christianity per se, or to religion, and to any type of great tradition ritual, it has nothing to do with values. It has to do with dramatization of the supernatural world. So that's really different from a model that's based on Pentecostals and New Guinea.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. No, I get completely your point. And of course I work with Protestants, and lots of people argue that a lot of anthropological theory of religion and ritual is very Protestantized.
Yeah.
So, and I don't, I mean, it raises the question of whether the ritual is one thing, of course, across these. I mean, one of the things I was happy enough to do in this paper that I knew was contentious is say, okay, let's say religion equals some kind of transcendence, and I didn't even define ritual, but I tied it up with religion and therefore with transcendence. I'd certainly be open to the possibility that there are kinds of things that are called rituals that don't, I guess this goes to that don't do this at all. I'd be interested in those societies, because part of this argument for me, the way I gave it today is a critique of the ordinary ethics people, which is very important within contemporary anthropology for me. But the larger argument about finding values in the world responds to a problem in value theory in general, which is where are values? You know, and I've tried to turn that into kind of a question of, well, where do the people I study find their values? So I've argued elsewhere for the argument, they also find them in these kind of exemplary figures who aren't exemplary in a role model kind of sense. They're actually fairly extreme because they do kind of one value. Nobody else lives one value, but you have one character in Robin who's willful all the time. He's married to 3 people, one of whom is his daughter. You know, he's just, and they love him. Nobody wants to be him, but they are transfixed by him. And another is a Christian pastor who really is completely lawful. By contrast, his wife died when they were very young, right after his daughter. So he's never remarried because marriage involves you with in-laws, and in-laws involve you with willfulness. They didn't get to wear willfulness. And so he's kind of the paradigm of lawfulness. Nobody can live like, but they talk about them all the time. So I would still imagine, even in societies where ritual wasn't doing this, there'd have to be some place where people were seeing values in these kind of fuller forms than you stumble upon them regularly. So that said, I would be open to the idea that maybe ritual is too big a basket, and maybe I'm talking about one tradition of ritual that does this. And this would begin to address your question, but I still think that we'd have to find some kinds of very fully worked out representations of values somewhere, if that makes sense. Yeah, saints. Well, that's another, in fact, I've had a lot of conversations with somebody who knows a lot more about saints than I do. Yes, I think, and Peter Brown has an article in that regard too. So yes, I think that's right. Yeah. Thanks for not asking me about evil, which is a real weak point of all this talk about value, which usually comes up. Okay.
Mary Elizabeth Moore, School of Theology and Graduate Division of Religion. You're focusing on transcendence as the supernatural or the transhuman.
Yeah.
But transcendence can also mean transcending self,
Yes.
or transcending one's own culture, transcending one's own assumptions, ethical or religious or social.
Yeah.
So, do you understand transcendence as conceivably including the transcendent that is not necessarily supernatural? And if so, how do you does it function in a similar way? And let me just add one tiny little addition to this. You've referred to the performative acts of prayer and religious ritual.
Yeah.
There are also performative acts of transcending self or transcending culture. Ritual traditions of shared meals, ritual traditions of hospitality to the stranger, and so forth, may not necessarily happen in the same formalized religious patterns, but might actually be a very big part of religion.
Yes. Yes.
So, do you think the dynamics are similar? And if so, what's the value of studying those anthropologically, and how do you relate them with the supernatural?
I mean, first of all, I do think that transcending self is very deep in this model of value. Hans Joas, the sociologist, pretty much defines values as the transcendence of self. And I think Durkheim's doing something kind of similar. I mean, I have some language like that here, but no argument. That part of what values do to people is they draw them out of themselves. They do sort of, I mean, Durkheim's point about society is greater than and better than yourself is partially an argument about drawing you beyond yourself. And I think values are often experienced by people as moving them beyond. That's part of that second, moving them beyond where they might be if just left to their own devices. So in the part of the world I work in New Guinea, certainly any kind of eating together is often treated as ritual. So I wouldn't exclude that at all. And I guess we get back to the Eucharist a little bit. I mean, so I wouldn't have trouble treating that in the same framework, but also I wouldn't have trouble seeing that as kind of a ritual, sort of. The overcoming, sort of transcending your own society, that's, this is the kind of answer that makes anthropologists unpopular with non-anthropologists. One thing is often argued for New Guinea, well, no, this isn't fair. Robin have it's a language group, they have a very strong sense of the boundaries of themselves. Their traditional rituals always connected them to their neighbors because they had to do them with their neighbors. There was kind of a ritual. This is Frederick Barth's work all the way back. There was a ritual division of labor throughout this region, so people from different language groups all had to do their rituals for the whole cosmos to work. They had different rituals, and they all had to do them. So actually for this group, And they see Christianity as connecting them much more broadly than their own region. That's part, they'll say in their services, they'll say, God, on their Sunday services, they'll say, God, everyone, everywhere today is praying to you. So they see themselves as, these people are really very remote, they don't have roads connecting them to anywhere, or no radio, they have radios to receive, but no two-way radio. They see themselves as connected. So I guess it does draw them out of their sense of social enclosure also. And Christianity in general, part of its huge appeal to them is that it connects them. They see themselves as acting in a much broader world. But I think all values do have this self-transcending quality, and so when rituals would dramatize them, in the logic of the argument, you'd almost say they would have to do that. So I would definitely agree with that. I don't know that one of the reasons to start with Schutz is I don't think the supernatural is a category for him. I mean, it could be if it's a category for the actors, but so I don't think it precludes it or demands it. I think the transcendent is kind of an important idea to rescue from being trapped in any one. It has a range of meanings, and it's useful to keep them all in play. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'm Septemi from Harvard Divinity School alumni of School of Theology.
Okay.
Thank you for the fascinating lecture. I'm from Indonesia, and when I was listening to your lecture, I could not stop thinking
Yeah.
of the situation there. You're talking about ritual and space,
Yeah.
and you imagine a church as an inside space.
Yes.
People come into. This is one story from Indonesia where
Yeah.
Christian forced to live their inside space, and they have to find outside to worship.
Yeah.
And there is one case where they just celebrated last month their 100 times of Sundays worshiping in front of the presidential palace.
Ah, yeah.
So coming from within this situation, I have two questions.
Yeah.
What happened to the ordinary when you have to worship outside?
Outside.
And the outside has become a contested
Oh,
space
yeah.
between religious and
Yeah.
politics. And then by implication, what happened to the transcendence?
Are these charismatic Christians, by the way?
The same, it's reform.
Okay. I mean, the reason I'm asking only is
It's
that
not,
sort of
it's not charismatic.
you have a lot of people in New Guinea praying in front of the parliament, and also now chopping down the
It is
traditional
It
statuary.
is a form of protest
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
the political.
And that's become very important in Pentecostalism all over now, a kind of focus of national. Robin would use their Pentecostalism to criticize the nation and identify with the wider global Christian community. This goes back, but a lot of what I'm reading in ethnology from other places now is people trying to save the nation, reform the nation. It's much more nationally. It's sort of a trend within global Pentecostalism that I'm seeing anyway. But in terms of the inside-outside, that you'd want to know what those terms meant to those people before. So Robin have a very strong identification of the church as an inside, and in fact, when you pray, you have to close the doors of the church, and so I'd have to know what that particular notion was doing there to be able to say. I guess I'd have to know where they're coming from.
Yeah,
Like-
it's because the Muslim radicals
Yeah,
forced them to leave the church building.
I see.
And they
Okay.
couldn't
Ah.
enter the church building, so they have to worship in members' houses, and every other Sunday, they decide to go in front of the presidential
And that's a
palace.
protected space, I take it. Nobody can evict them from the front of the
Yeah,
presidential.
but they were surrounded by police personnel and military personnel in order to
Oh.
And then just recently, church buildings set, to fire by other Muslim radical groups. But because based on that, there are different phases of ordinary, of
Yes.
everydayness. I think I come from that.
Yeah, no, I think that's, well, right, and I guess part of the question for them is what ordinary is there? Wow, it sounds like a very complex situation on the ground, so the first thing, you're studying this, I hope, or just taking note, or just send somebody? No, it would be great to know more of that. I mean, in one sense, for what the inside means to the Robin, which is sort of set apart, protected, because you close the door. Part of the way you close the doors is when you pray, you close your eyes, you're very vulnerable. Somebody in your Robins sleep in these one-room households with extended families, but always some man will be awake with his eyes open. I mean, that's a real important sense of security for your Robin. So to close your eyes is an enormous act of trusting in God, but you also close the church door so that nothing bad comes in while you're doing it. So they really seal it off. But with the police protection and all that, I mean, I wonder if that isn't, in whatever inside means for the Robin, I wonder if that space in front of the presidential palace is not somewhat inside in a similar sense. But again, the symbolism could be different. But yeah, where the everyday is and what, I mean, I think in some ways, maybe, part of Vina Das's argument is the everyday is so important because it's not, can't be taken for granted. I mean, she highly values, and she'll talk about values, but she very much values the everyday. Because working in India and looking particularly at the time after the partition, she's interested in the reestablishment of the everyday. So these are also people for whom the everyday would be a huge accomplishment.
One of our promises in this session is that we always end at a certain time, and we are, I know some people have to go, but we're in a very congested room. So as to exit in an orderly way, I am going to sort of keep to the ritual convention of this lecture and have us close it up in 4 minutes, if that's okay. So just
you guys ask, I'm not going to answer because I go on too long.
I have a whole bunch of things I'd love to talk to you about. The beginning of your talk was really striking because on Friday at SSR, I'm going to be giving a paper on the way lived religion has come to be used as a category in sociology of religion, and it parallels all the stuff about binaries you're talking about. It's not elite, it's not institution, it's not belief.
Yes,
all that.
Yeah.
Really interesting to see the parallel here. But when I'm Nancy Ammerman, the Sociology of Religion. And the way you talk about transcendence is actually a little different from the way I talk about transcendence, because I really do talk about it in the everyday, in the sort of permeability of the boundaries between the ordinary and the extraordinary in everyday life. And so, I think one of the things that I'm hearing in the conversation about your talk is that there really are all these different moments when we connect with something beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
That it's not just, perhaps, in these kinds of rituals that you're looking at, that there are lots of ways that transcendence is invoked and practiced in different societies. And one of the issues in moving from the kind of ethnography or anthropology in the setting that you're looking at, and some of the challenges you've gotten from different people in the room, I think may be about, in fact, the relative complexity of the societies and religions in those societies, and the sort of length of history of practice and ritual, so that the Eucharist, as it's practiced in the US, and there are actually lots of interesting ethnographies of the Eucharist, part of what you get is that because of the complexity of the history of that ritual, it carries lots of different meanings, not just to different places, but to the very people in a given celebration of that ritual. So that what you get with a much more complex and a longer history of a particular ritual may be that it's not a single value that's being highlighted.
I mean, I will answer quickly, but I do agree completely about, and this goes all the way back to both of these remarks, actually go back and touch on issues that came. I am, in one way, I'm trapped in the rhetoric of the everyday ephesus, is that, okay, I'm going to make the transcendent different from the everyday, because they've kicked it out, and I'm going to say, but by the end of the paper, which I went through too fast, what I'm saying is, of course, everyday life is shot through. And I have that quote from Schutz, that the everyday couldn't exist without what he calls the transcendent, because nothing And so I'm completely in agreement. And the end of that, if it were longer, is trying to say, okay, now we could see where these things are there in the everyday. Yeah, obviously I've done a certain kind of field work with a certain kind of group. It's partially out of this performative theory of ritual. I would imagine, I'd like to imagine, I have no idea, that people who do rituals tell you they're doing a certain kind of thing, and that would point to realizing a certain kind of value. Now, maybe people are doing different things. It may be that one person is doing the ritual for one reason and one's doing it for another, but I'm kind of stuck on this idea. But of course, they may not be, so I'm completely open to correction on that.
Just a really quick final note that sometimes I think the most explicit and unified meaning of ritual is precisely in the public kinds of rituals that Septime was talking about, where people intentionally get out there in front of people in order to convey something.
In that sense, it may not be an accident that the Sunday service is the most public, routinized, or I don't want to say routinized isn't the right word, but it's public, everybody comes back for it. You know everybody's going to be there. That's why the big man insists on doing the politics there. And those spirit dances are also the highest participation, most publicized. So yes, that's a good point. Those are both very public rituals in the European sense. Okay, that's...
Well, by now you realize that my performance of the promise was actually a lie. Couldn't be an academic without that, but I want to thank everybody for coming, and I hope everybody would join with me in thanking.
I'll answer your question.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
You have